Good morning. I'm so excited to talk to you about the things that we've been learning about how space can make a difference in healthcare. And Thomas had my brain going all over the place, so I thought I'd better bring my cheat sheet to get started up here, my idiot sheet. I wanted to also thank the Mayo for providing a space for all of us to innovate about healthcare, to come together in a real space, in real time. Steelcase really believes in the power of this kind of a happening. And of course, the Mayo team has been wonderful to work with. I wanted to start with this concept of the pull of healthcare and talk a little bit about how not only is that part of the fundamental, foundational story of how Nurture came to be, but it's also a personal story for me. And that the pull of healthcare has been serendipity. It's been a gift for me. And I grew up in a household of 2 surgeons, 2 other siblings. That's 2 surgeons and parents in one house. I can show you the emotional scars later. But being pulled into healthcare in my career now has been a real gift because I've been able to look at my childhood in a completely different way. John had this great quotation from T.S. Eliot on Sunday that really resonated with me as I was thinking about how I look back at different parts of my childhood now in a completely new way, with new eyes, as if for the first time. And I remember this one instance where my dad, who was a general surgeon in this small town where we grew up in Western New York, came home for dinner, which was unusual in and of itself. And then after dinner, seemed kind of late in the evening to me as a child, someone came to the front door. And my dad went to the front door to answer it, and there was a family there. And he invited the family in to our front parlor. You guys know what a front parlor, do people have parlors anymore? The fancy room that nobody uses, right, except for guests. My dad invited that family in to the front parlor, and they talked about life. They talked about some decisions that were needed to be made in the evening, that late evening, couldn't come into the office for some reason, about the family. And even though that space, that room where my mom had made the curtains, was a world away from the operating room, a world away from the hospital, it really was the essence of healthcare. And I think about that moment in a different way now. As a child, I thought, oh, no, more time that my dad's not here, and I don't want anything to do with healthcare, and yet here I am in healthcare. And part of the reason is because this pull of those emotional moments that are so human. And at that time, I realized now as I look back at that time, I realized that any space could become a healthcare space. And so now I ask myself as a challenge and my team at Nurture as a challenge, what are we going to do about that? So there are a lot of constraints. Thomas's talk was so great. There's so many things to think about in terms of the design of healthcare spaces. Our particular approach, I was looking for a way to drive clarity around the way that we approach it at Steelcase and at Nurture. And I thought a quick review of Proxemics would help to bring some clarity, because it's our path to innovation in healthcare, how we think we can make a difference in healthcare. So Edward T. Hall was this anthropologist who came up with this term. He coined the phrase Proxemics and came up with this idea of personal reaction bubbles, the spaces in which we interact with each other, and at Nurture we believe with objects and technology and information as well. And how you can compare across cultures. And of course, we know that cultures vary not just from country to country, but could vary between hospital floors or between office floors. And that in these different spaces, there are socially acceptable behaviors that we define as human beings as we relate to each other. And we believe at Nurture that these behaviors and designing with these behaviors in mind are a way for us to make a difference in healthcare. And so I want to share some of the early learnings that we had. In 2003, I had the gift, along with Steelcase, to be pulled into healthcare as a design researcher as part of a small team that was asked to go out into the field and look at clinical spaces. At that time, Steelcase had been providing a lot of office furniture into healthcare spaces, mostly on the carpet side. But we were being pulled into the clinical side, and we said, we were asked to go out and look out at what's happening on the clinical side, our furniture being used on the clinical side. And the doctors and the nurses had no idea why we wanted to observe their everyday behaviors in the hospital, But when we got there, we found not everyday behaviors. They were not ordinary at all. It was extraordinary. And yes, we saw our furniture being used, but it was being used in ways that we could barely recognize. So I want to share with you some of those learnings because they're foundational to the way that we think about space. And after a few observations, after visiting only a few sites, we came to the conclusion, our first big aha, that healthcare had changed, the behaviors had changed, technology had changed maybe, but its spaces had not. And what I mean by that is, of course, the spaces had changed. So for example, from when I was a child, there were a lot more people in the acute care setting, a lot more things, more technology and higher acuity. And yet the spaces had not kept up. So maybe that's a better word, as opposed to say they hadn't changed. So here's an example. I love this. Clearly office chairs, not wheelchairs, wheeled chairs. They are being used. What is going on here? That is not how they were designed to be used. Not even safe, at least to start with, right? But thinking about how this is really a message of how quickly things were happening, and as John was talking about exceptions, really getting down to the nitty-gritty, what is happening every day in healthcare, the speed and the frequency of activities on the acute care floor. This is another great one. In this case, it's an observation about how the space can actually increase the cognitive load for a clinician. So you can't tell, but that sheet of paper or all those sheets of paper that are being taped together have about, I don't know, a list of information that maybe is in 12-point type, right? And this nurse is trying to read it at a distance while she's dragging a phone cord across her coworker's space. And we asked the question, how could space not add to the cognitive load? How could it remove the cognitive load? Oh, this is one of my favorites. So this is this is sort of the amino acid, it's a foundational behavior in healthcare. And if you look, that was really good learning for us here, was that there are at least 3 major architectural elements going on in this social space. The proxemics of this social relationship, it's actually personal space, right, because it's only about 4 feet. The first major architectural element is this wall back here. And you can see how they're engaged in the wall in a personal, intimate way, leaning on that wall. But the other 2 architectural elements, we don't usually think about it this way, are the clinicians themselves. They're creating this 3-sided space, and we see this over and over again, this behavior. And the minor architectural element in here, which we see over and over again, of course, is this connection point of the work surface. And so one of the things in designing spaces that it's easy to forget is that we, our human bodies, our physicality in healthcare also create architecture, and you have to predict for that because that's architecture that's moving around the space in lots of different ways. So here you see it again. Of course, now the wall, you've got a partial wall here, but you've got the technology, the flat screens, that are also creating a wall. And I love the ingenuity of these nurses that are using those recycling bins also as part of their proxemics. And then this last photo I included because every time I think about these original observations, I think about how we went to observe what we thought was maybe going to be office work. And in fact, what we observed was extreme work. We started to call it extreme work, work that was happening no matter what. And at this time in our journey, we've been solving for those extremes, going from space to space and really looking at sort of prescribed behaviors that are happening in these extreme spaces and solving for those. I want to show you a little bit about how healthcare is starting to think about goals. If our goal at Nurture is to really think about how, at a minimum, we can get space to get out of the way, and in best case scenario, to really be a great support and to be a system support to enable the behaviors that we want. We look at something like HCAP scores, which you guys may be familiar with. It's basically patient satisfaction. And it allows comparison, but it also is supposed to be providing incentives for changing the quality of care. And these are some of the topics that are included in the patient satisfaction survey. And when a lot of folks who are in architecture and design look at this list, they call out things like cleanliness, quietness, the overall rating, the willingness to recommend the hospital as things that space can affect. And when we look at this list, we say, why can't we affect all of these things? Doesn't context have an effect on all of these things? And shouldn't space design have an effect on all of these things? That's our goal. So let me show you a little bit of how we think that we can do that. So you're seeing an installation here at the University of Utah, South Jordan. It's a new clinic. Actually, this is an installation photo, so things are still being moved around. But can you see in this solution that amino acid of behavior, the foundational behavior? Could that happen right here, right? Or all along here, and, right, the rest, how the space, putting a footbreast there, space tells you how to behave and just to be impertinent. Right? If I drew a picture of a beer there, that behavior standing at the bar was really familiar. And so we see that familiarity and we can encourage that behavior. And when you think about the spaces, let me get this back in here. Being designed, oh, what's happening? So that now behaviors could be different to the extent which teams actually might start to create different processes by which they practice medicine. That the speed at which they're collaborating might change. And the speed at which they're exchanging information might change because the porosity of the space has changed and the behavior is being cued into by the way the space is designed. So one of the things that we're asking ourselves now is where is healthcare headed next? And this question that John keeps asking, what are you doing tomorrow? What are you doing in a year? What are you going to be doing in 5 years? We ask ourselves that as well. And of course, as designers, the first question is, well, what does the future look like? Visioning exercise, right? The future looks like this. Information's floating, bodies are floating, and the best part, everybody looks like a supermodel. Can't wait for that future. And even though these images are really inspiring, and they're super inspiring, and this one was an expensive image, believe me, very inspiring to designers, it creates a problem. It creates the myth of one future. And we know from our research that there is a multiplicity of futures that's happening. It's happening right now. It's going to be happening in a year, 5 years. And so how do we solve for that? How can I have the simplicity that I want and desire in one image and yet be able to see the multiplicity of futures that are coming, and how can I plan for that? So I've been using this metaphor of what old school photographers used to call making a picture. Photographers don't say take a picture. Real photographers say make a picture. I made this picture, because they're talking about the decisions that they've made, the opinions that they've created in this image, the choices, the accountability. And the tools that they use, I don't know if people even remember what these things are. Aperture, f-stop, right? Deciding what's in the foreground, what's in the background. Is that blurry or is that clear? Is that blurry or is that clear? You even used to have to choose the speed of your film. And so this is the kind of picture, these are the kind of pictures that we're starting to play with now. These are some of the issues, some of the choices that we're putting on the canvas and deciding what to put in the foreground, what to put in the background, and deciding what might be blurry and what might be in focus. And of course, I way oversimplified it. This is really what the image looks like from the design research perspective, right? It's very messy. And so now we're in the stage where we're developing the picture. We're in the darkroom stage at Nurture. And there's a lot of things that go on in the darkroom too, right? You got to mess with the enlarger. There's a developer bath. How long are you going to leave that in the bath? What kind of paper am I going to choose? And the example that I want to share with you today is really about an example, actually Thomas talked about it, about spaces that we're observing are very often forgotten about. We spend a lot of time early on in Nurture's career development, growth as a company, on these extreme spaces where there's a lot of action, there's a lot of focus. And we're turning our attention now to these spaces that are kind of ignored. And we're using those spaces. We found that they become inspirational for us to think about how any space could become a healthcare space, because every space probably already is a healthcare space. Much ignored, much maligned space. And in our jobs, we try not to judge. However, when I look at this image, I personally suffer from migraines. I really hope this was not in a pain clinic. and really hope that it wasn't in a clinic where they're treating patients with vertigo. But you see how complex, right? When you get down to it, how complex design is, all these little factors that you have to keep in mind. Who would have thought? That's affecting the patient's experience, it's affecting the clinician's experience. And then what does this kind of space tell you to do? How does it tell you to act? But also, how does it make you feel? The unintentional messages of the space. And then getting to the heart of it, there's lots of these other photographs. I showed this one because it looks like kind of like what we heard about yesterday, that this family is doing nothing. But you know and I know this family is not doing nothing. Their loved one is in surgery. There's all kinds of things going on in here, and they're exhausted. And I know lots of people who come to us and say, we want to do away with these spaces. These spaces are of no value. Nobody likes them. People hate these spaces. We agree. They're terrible spaces. But the needs of the human beings in these spaces don't go away just because you take that space away. The needs are still there. They're shifted. You can't ignore the needs. There's lots of things that people are trying to get done or accomplish or feel, work through in these kinds of spaces. How do we continue to solve for that? And is this a space? This was my space. These were forms that I was asked to fill out on my lap with a phone in one hand, right, trying to find the information that they asked for. So thinking about also how information as it relates to space. And in this particular case, the office that had asked me to create a relationship and provide some data was important enough that they took the time to do that and asked me to take my time. And yet this is the kind of relationship that's being defined. And so on our journey in the darkroom, as we're developing our images, we're trying to figure out how do we cost-effectively, efficiently allow other people to use our products as design tools to create many futures tomorrow, a year, maybe even 5 years. As the human behaviors, the social behaviors actually don't change that much, but our needs are changing. And so we asked the question, what if you had a space where you could have an intimate relationship? What if we supported that? People want to have an intimate relationship. What if an intimate relationship was with technology, and actually maybe this is a public relationship. Maybe it's more about reaching out to lots of other folks outside of that particular space where you are in order to gain knowledge. Or maybe that same space could be used from a social perspective because I want to have a coaching moment, or I want to share, or I want to teach, or I want to learn. Or what if healthcare had social spaces? What would a social space in healthcare look like? What would you use that for? How could we leverage a social space? Physical social space. And what about a public space? Back one too far. What might public spaces in healthcare look like? And so this multiplicity of futures that we're hoping other folks will help us to discover, we're really early on in our journey. Steelcase is a company that's celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. Nurture is less than 10 years old. We're not even in our adolescence of understanding what we might do in the healthcare space. And so we're constantly looking for mentors, guides, partners. And I'd like to invite any of you who are interested in this journey to reach out and contact us and talk to us about how you think space could make a difference in healthcare. Thank you.